we can achieve more consistent results with more spend. So in this case, we would just scale up this audience. And then this audience here, 2 purchases at 15, 2 purchases at 20. Then our cost per purchase went up, stayed up at 50, and then went back down. Now it's going down, and it looks like it's starting to stay down more and more, which is good. And that is, you can see that when we scaled up, we actually saw a rise in cost per purchase, but we scaled back down after we noticed that. And because of that, we're able to get more purchases for that budget. And so we can see that the auction overlap is actually really low here, and we get more purchases with a lower auction overlap here. Auction competition is higher on the days that we had a high cost per purchase. So overall, this one's also pretty, stable in this case. So we could also just look at keeping this budget fairly consistent and getting additional purchases out of it. If we go to the self-awareness audience, we have a longer time frame here. It actually pulls in about the full 30 length day mark here, and we got a lot more purchases to look at. Amount spent is much higher on this one. First time impression ratio has been fairly stable. Auction overlap is fairly stable. Auction competition is also fairly stable in this case. And in reality, we could end up scaling this one further because our cost per purchase is fairly stable overall. We're getting a pretty consistent cost per result. So that's good to know. And that makes sense because most of these audiences are dialed in, which is why all of them are around that $40 mark, which makes sense because we're getting really consistent results based off of these metrics. We did find 2 opportunities within these 2 audiences to adjust the budgets. So let's go ahead and look at another ad account to get a better idea of potential opportunities we could take. All right, so we're in another audience here, and this one has about 664 purchases in the last 30 days at a $20 cost per purchase, so we have a lot more data to actually look at overall. If we inspect the interest audience, we can get an idea of what's going on. So our purchases, this is really interesting, our amount spent as we scaled up followed our purchase trend line. So check this out. So as we increase our spend, we're actually getting more and more purchases, meaning this audience is very scalable, which is super awesome. And we have very low auction overlap rate, and that is purely because we only have about 3 active audiences in cold. So we actually have a very low auction overlap rate. So that's really good. And you can see that this audience is very scalable because of that. When we had a high auction overlap, that's during the testing phase. Once through the testing phase, we started to scale up, and you can see the phases that we've gone through in this actual, 2.0 course where we talk about, the testing phase and the optimization phase and the scaling phase. And you can see that direct correlation here, where after we got out of testing, we started to scale. And because we were, getting down to our best performing audiences, we were able to scale the primary one being this one up. And we're seeing a much higher number of purchases. And as we actually scale back down this audience, we actually see a decrease in purchases. And our auction competition is it's probably one of the lowest auction competition rates I've seen in a while. And that is from having an audience that, is not only fairly large in size, but also because we're focusing in on our best performing ones. And so therefore, this is a very scalable audience. If you remember from the auction competition, if it's lower than minus 20% and you have a consistent cost per result, which we do, then this is an opportunity for you to scale up without having to worry about high competition. So exactly what we just covered here is what you're seeing. You can see right here, we start to see the decrease in auction competition. And because we're scaling up right here, we're able to scale hitting a peak scale of $256 per day. And at that same time period, we're actually minus 52. So this is such a high opportunity for scale. We can continue scaling here because there's just this high opportunity to constantly reach more people without having to worry about competition, which is really incredible. This is how you hit high scale volume. Being able to do 250, 500, even, $600, $1,000 days, and not have to worry about a decrease in performance because you're still able to consistently hit that. And our frequencies are climbing up over time, which makes sense as we're scaling. But our cost per purchase has remained fairly consistent even though our frequencies are increasing. Now our first time impression ratio is, fairly low, but it's not negatively impacting performance. So there's nothing to really worry about there. And as you can see, first time impression ratio, you'll determine if a decline in performance is linked to audience saturation. So in this case, it's not linked, and this is just a blue ocean of opportunity to truly continue to scale this audience because we've really dialed this in. All right, so let's look at another one, our lookalike audience, which has more purchases, about 392 purchases, and this has been fairly consistent for a while now, and our amount spent has actually subtly decreased because it looks like we get better performance at a lower amount spent overall, which is really nice. And our auction competition is actually decreasing around here. So we had high competition when we were actually spending more per day. So as you can see, when we started hitting that $800 per day mark, we had a very high competition. We realized that, pulled down spend some more. And as we pulled down spend back to that $250 per day, we actually saw an increase in overall purchase volume, significant increase, and a significant decrease in auction competition, which means we still have even more opportunity to start to scale back up again, which is really amazing. And auction overlap rate is extremely low, 1.83, and that's purely from only really having 2 to 3 cold audiences. But during the testing phase, it's very normal to have a very high auction overlap rate because you're testing and you're identifying which ones are performing and which ones are not. And then our frequencies are remaining fairly stable with only about a 0.1 increase every few days here, which is nothing of too concern. We do have, a 3% frequency or a 3 frequency on cold, which is not necessarily a bad thing if our actual results are fairly consistent. In this case, they are. And so what we can do is we can look at that last 7-day mark, about 108 purchases in the last 7 days, 227 at $12, and then before then, we spent the same amount, so $2,800 that week, $2,800 this week, and we actually got a decrease in cost per result. So that's really amazing. So overall, results really consistent here. And if we see this audience here was primarily ran within that same time frame, it had about 14 purchases at a $22 cost per result, but was turned off, and that also helps with the overall deliverability. So once you get down to those, primary 1 to 2 audiences that are really performing and you start to really scale them up, you're able to hit, consistent numbers. And so that's what it looks like when you're actually at a high scale account. Now, if we look at the actual retargeting, we can see we're hitting just as many purchases, and we can inspect these audiences as well. 394 in the last 30 days here. Cost per purchase was actually higher, and that's during that December period, which makes sense, and then lower cost per result since a lot of advertisers pulled out their spend. And you can actually see that auction competition rate during those few days before Christmas are extremely high. But then the decrease after everybody pulled out their budget, and we were still spending just about as much money holding our budgets all the way through, and we're seeing a dramatic increase in purchase volume. Look at this purchase volume just go way up. And our auction competition is so low, so there is a huge opportunity once again to constantly remain at a high volume per day of purchases, which is absolutely incredible. Low auction overlap rate, even within our own retargeting audiences. This means that we're getting so many individuals viewing the video ads, so many individuals interacting with the ads, that we have a large bucket to constantly pull from without having to worry about competing against ourselves constantly. And we have a 12 frequency here on retargeting, which, if anything, is only helping us get a better cost per result because we're showing the ads multiple times to individuals. And you can see that we are refreshing creatives on a weekly cadence. So every week we're refreshing creatives, and that ensures that we're having a creative refresh, we're keeping the auction competition rate low, we're increasing results, we're keeping things stable within spend. So this is what a dialed in ad account looks like when you're on a routine, scheduled cadence of launching creatives on a regular basis based off what you know is working. And then once you actually see these beautiful trend lines, this is when you know you've made, the results at scale, and you're able to start see this consistency. This is what consistency would start to look like. So if you have very low first impression ratio, extremely high auction overlap, extremely high auction competition, you can start to make these tweaks and pull these different levers to see what relations affect one another. You can also see time periods also affect auction competition. So this is where you can learn to really understand what is going to move each metric, and you can make these changes and start to see your results improve and become more consistent. And it's totally normal to have a very low first impression ratio in retargeting. That is actually, expected, because you should have already reached these individuals for the first time already with your cold. And you should be spending a good amount on your retargeting to ensure that your cold is able to reach new individuals, because you don't want your cold audience to compensate for a lack of retargeting spend. So let's look at another retargeting audience, which is our add to carts last 30 days. So since it's dynamic, we can't inspect that, but we have a site visitors, we can. Consistent spend here, we decreased it at the beginning of the year after the holidays. Purchases increased, and our auction overlap has started to climb up, and our frequencies are about at 9, but overall, nothing's really negatively impacting performance. If anything, we're seeing a really solid, consistent trend here. So as long as we continue to launch new creatives on this 7-day cadence, then we're going to be able to consistently hold our metrics and make progress. So overall, this is what a very dialed in, account looks like, which these metrics are really consistent and very nice for scale. So overall, we covered the inspect tool, how to analyze performance. We looked at a consistent account. We looked at a high scale account. We looked at the audience overlap, understanding how that can affect performance. We looked into the auction competition. As you saw, a much lower auction competition rate, specifically a minus 50%, offered a huge opportunity for us to get a lot of results. We actually scaled up our results without actually having to move our spend by very much. In the audience saturation, we had a very low first time impression ratio on retargeting, which is totally normal. And we also had a low audience saturation in our cold and still saw great results. And that is because we were at scale. But if you see a low audience saturation, a high competition, and a high overlap, then that is a negative indicator. And then we also covered our first time impression ratios, so that way you can better understand how many new people you're reaching and what that ratio should look like and what relation it has to your overall results. I hope you enjoyed this module. Thank you so much. Cheers and bye.